All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another hand analysis. I'm Austin, and I'm here to analyze another hand with you guys. Okay, so today's hand is a 5 cent, 10 cent table online, and I thought it was a relatively interesting spot, so let's jump into it. Okay, so we are in the small blind, and we are dealt ace-2 suited. Folds around to the button, who raises to 2.2 big blinds. What would you guys do in this situation? Would you fold, would you call, or would you raise? Give you a second to pause the video and think it through. Okay, well, according to my hand chart that I've been trying to follow, this is a raise situation. I'm not 100% sure why. It might have to do with game theory or something, so I'm not sure if it's 100% wise. I mean, game theory is, I guess, pretty good overall, but I'm not that advanced yet. So, yeah. So, anyways, I decide to raise based on the hand chart, and so that's what I do. Raise to about three times his bet. And before that, we should be thinking of some questions here. We should be thinking of A, um, what is the table dynamic? Is there a lot of fish here? A lot of people playing a lot of hands? Um, yeah, like what is likely to happen if we bet or call? So I'm actually not sure of this. I don't even remember if I can. I don't even remember the table dynamic, to be honest. I'm not sure if I do at the time either. Oh, excuse me. But so the table dynamic is unknown. And so the question is, another question that we want to ask ourselves is, do we want to be going heads up, or do we want to be going multi-way, or no way? And the answer to that is probably no way, because we don't have like a super strong hand. We have a relatively strong hand that can hit some draws and can also hit the ace. But we probably want to just take it down here. So that's why I think a raise is probably pretty good. Another question to ask ourselves is, what is the stack pot ratio after the flop? Everyone here is stacked about 100 big blinds or more. So if I bet 60 cents and I get one caller, we're looking at about 10, about a 10 SPR. If we're looking at three callers, that would be about a 6 SPR. Both of them are still relatively high. 10's high, 6 is in the like middle zone high. So we have some room to play our draw. If that's what SPR kind of lets you know, is like if you're on a more drawing hand, are people more pot committed already, so there's not much room for implied odds or bluffing, or are people not pot committed, like this situation where we can have more room for bluffing or implied odds. Okay, so I raised it three times his bet. We get a fold, and then the button calls. Alright, so flop comes 10-6-3, we whiffed it. And what would you guys do in this situation? Would you check or would you bet? Give you a second to pause and think it through. Okay, well, personally, I like probably a check here. We missed the flop pretty hard. We don't have any draws. but I wouldn't be opposed to a bet here because we did pre-bet the pre-flop. Although we aren't representing hitting much unless we have a pocket pair. So yeah, I went ahead and bet half the pot, and he decides to call. Now this is an interesting call. He has position, and he could know that based on our range, we're not super likely to be hitting this flop. So he could just be floating here. And if he's floating, we're in still okay shape. If he's not floating and has some kind of draw, or he has connected to any of the board cards, we're not in good shape. So that's probably pretty obvious that I think I just said. But anyways, so yeah, I guess we should be thinking about his range a little bit, but we'll come to that on the next street. Okay, so the next card is the Ten of Hearts. Relatively good for us, because if he didn't hit the flop, he didn't hit the turn. But not great for us, obviously. Also, it doesn't complete any draws. So, what would you guys do in the situation? Would you check or would you bet? Give you a second to pause and think it through. Okay, well, I decided to check. We are not in great shape as a hand. We're out of position. Yeah, I just don't like our spot here very much. But he decides, or whoops, we decide to check, and he decides to bet about 2/3 the pot, more than 2/3 the pot. Big bet. All right, so now we have some questions to ask ourselves. What are the pot odds that we're getting? We're getting about 2.5 to 1, probably a little less. Is there anyone left to act behind us? No. This is a checklist I go through whenever I face a bet. I learned this from Red Chip Poker, by the way. Then what is our hand versus his hand range? Well, that's a good question. What can we put him on here? We put him on a pretty wide array of hands, especially if he floated the flop. We can put him on a very wide range of hands. All the pocket pairs, all the suited connectors, all the one gappers, all the cusp hands, and some of the trash hands. Excuse me. And so given that, what would you guys do in the situation? Would you check, or sorry, would you call, would you fold, or would you raise? I guess that's the other two questions that we have to ask ourselves is, what if we raised? Well, if we raised, we probably would be representing a 10 or a flush, not a flush draw. So we might induce some folds if like he has a 6 or a 3. So that's interesting. Never thought about that actually. What if we call? If we call, we're not in great shape. We have to hit the ace basically. Just 3 outs. 6% chance. We could be beating some of his air holdings already. with just the ace high. So I don't like the call. Oh, sorry, I'll let you guys decide. What would you guys do in this situation? Would you call, would you fold, or would you raise? Okay, hopefully you paused the video and thought it through. Like I was saying, I don't like the call. I like the fold or the raise. I would probably fold here. Raise is an interesting spot, or interesting idea. It's not a bad idea, I don't think. Okay, so of course you could be continuing with a lot of straight draws, like gut shot straight draws, which means we would have to put in more money on the river if he doesn't hit. Beautiful. Oh, like that. So, I don't know. I guess I lean towards a fold. And that's what we did. Okay, so now let's check out Flopzilla. Okay. Uh-oh, Flopzilla crashed? No, didn't crash. Alright. Did it crash? No. Okay. So this is the hand range that I put him on after he called the flop bet. So we raised on the pre-flop, and so I took off. I wish I could save this. Let's save this real fast. Store range, temporary. Okay. All right, so let's look at the button. All right, this is the hand range I have for button opening. And then after I make a 3-bet and he calls, we take off all of these hands, these cusp and junk hands. And similarly over here. Okay. So that's how I got towards this range. And then after I bet and he calls, I took off a lot of other hands, like, they're not a lot, but just some other hands. I think I kept ace queen there, just because some people like to, when they have 2 high cards, they like to continue even if they missed. And then I changed these over to he would only continue with these broadways if they were the right suit, which is suited diamonds, because he would have the flush draw. And same with these aces, middling aces. Okay, so that's how I got to this range. Okay, so as you can see, with ace 2 of hearts against this range, we have about a 19% equity. Okay. Now, how about if that's if he was playing somewhat selectively. Um, if sorry if this is unclear, I'm trying to be as clear as possible. Okay, so that's if on the flop he only called our raise with something that he hit the flop with. Like he had a pair, he had a flush draw, he had a gut shot straight draw, maybe even a open-ended straight draw. Let's see, can he? Yeah, 4-5. He had a set. And I also included 2 high cards like ace king or ace queen. Okay, so obviously overpair and whatnot. So that's if he's being somewhat selective on the flop bet. So now let's say he just floated and we take off these hands. This is just from the pre-flop raise call that he made. Okay, so this is his hand immediately after he calls pre-flop, his hand range. So, oops. So if he floated basically anything I had, anything that came on the flop, he floated just to plan on bet on the turn or something, this is what he would have. And our equity would be about 31%. Okay, so now I want to do some EV calculations. The first calculation we'll do is if he floated. So, oops, did I say 31%? Somehow I got to 35% last time I did this. Okay, so regardless, it'll still be positive, but so this is the equity if he floated with his full range on the flop. Okay, so equity, or sorry, his expected value, not equity. Oops, that's a typo. Okay, so expected value is percent of the time you win times the money you win minus the percent you lose times the money you lose. Okay, if you don't understand expected value, I recommend you look it up. I think maybe on YouTube there's probably some good videos explaining expected value. Okay, so let's just say 35% of the time, even though we just calculated 31% of the time, times 50 big blinds, which is how much was in the pot on the turn, minus 65% of the time we lose times 20 big blinds, which it costs us to call. Okay, and our expected value is 4.5 big blinds over the long run. Okay, so that's if you floated with everything on the flop, which is interesting because looking at that turn situation, it does not seem positive for us. So it's interesting. Okay, and then this is if he was somewhat selective in what he continued with. So that's supposed to be expected value. So if he's a little bit selective in continuing with gut shot, straight draw, a pair, ace king, ace queen, trips, overpair, etc. So same expected value formula. This time we're winning about 17% of the time. It's actually, we calculated around 19% of the time, but for some reason, that was before I calculated the flush draw options in his hand range. For some reason that brought it up for us. I guess that makes sense because he doesn't actually have a hand yet. So 0.17, 17% of the time times 50 big blinds times 72% of the time times 20 big blinds, and we get negative 5.75 big blinds over the long run. Okay, so that just goes to show you how I think it's really interesting that if he's just a little bit selective on what he floats with, then it becomes negative expected value for us to call his turn bet. But if he's just calling with his full hand range on the flop, and he's floating with his full hand range that you call him the flop pre-flop with, then it's all of a sudden positive EV for us to call on the turn, which I think is pretty fascinating. Okay, so hopefully you guys learned something from this. I'm trying to be as clear as possible. I think next time I'll probably do a practice video before I do the actual video so I can explain it a little bit better. Okay, so that's it for today, and hope you guys have a good day, and happy poker playing, happy grinding. See ya.